Imagine a peaceful town, its streets lined with cozy homes and friendly neighbors, where everyone knows each other's name. A place where laughter fills the air and the warmth of community seems unshakable. But behind one door, a secret festered that would unravel everything. The Harper family appeared to have it all. Mark, a respected sheriff admired for his service, Grace, a kind-hearted homemaker who everyone adored, and Sophia, their bright, imaginative daughter. To the outside world, they were perfect, a shining example of love and unity. But what if perfection was just a mask? One night, as the world around them slept, the silence of their home was broken by muffled voices and the faint echo of footsteps. It was then that a chain of events began. Events so shocking that they would leave the entire town reeling in disbelief. What happens when trust is shattered? When love turns into a weapon? How far will someone go to protect the innocent from unimaginable harm? These are the questions that haunted the quiet streets of Willow Creek. This story will reveal the depths of betrayal, the limits of a mother's resolve, and the price paid when darkness is hidden in plain sight. Stay with us as we unravel the chilling tale of the Harper family. Welcome to True Crime Theater HQ. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell for more gripping true crime stories. You won't want to miss what comes next. Willow Creek was the kind of town where life moved at its own gentle pace. Neighbors waved from across picket fences, children played on sunlit streets, and the air carried the comforting hum of familiarity. Everyone knew the Harpers. They weren't just members of the community, they were the heartbeat of it. Mark Harper, at 45, stood tall as a symbol of the town's values. As the local sheriff, he wore his badge with pride, not as a symbol of authority, but as a testament to his dedication to keeping Willow Creek safe. His steady hand and calm demeanor made him someone people naturally trusted. If there was ever a problem, Mark Harper was the one they turned to. He was the man who attended every town meeting, offered advice when needed, and made sure the streets remained as peaceful as the rolling hills surrounding them. Beside him was Grace Harper, the kind of woman who seemed to hold the world together with her warmth. She was a devoted wife and mother, spending her days ensuring her family's life was one of comfort and stability. Grace was the friendly face at every bake sale, the comforting shoulder at every hardship, and the quiet strength that so many admired. Her reputation extended far beyond her family. She was a friend to all and a judge to none. Yet it was her love for her daughter Sophia that defined her more than anything else. Sophia Harper, just 13 years old, was the light of their lives. She had a natural curiosity about the world, paired with a creativity that found its outlet in her love for drawing. But Sophia also faced challenges. Diagnosed with a developmental condition early in life, she saw the world through a lens different from her peers. Her mind worked in ways that were unique, often resembling the innocence and wonder of a much younger child. Though she needed extra care and attention, her joy was infectious, and her imagination knew no bounds. She painted worlds of bright colors, filled with stories and characters that seemed to leap off the page. Her eyes seemed to leap off the page, and sometimes her eyes reminded him of the family he had never had. To the people of Willow Creek, the Harpers were an ideal family. Mark's dedication, Grace's warmth, and Sophia's charm made them beloved fixtures in their small town. They were the kind of family that others admired, the kind people looked to as proof that good, honest lives could still exist in a complicated world. Blunt and a bit condescending, to prove she was not. Behind the closed doors of their well-kept home, there were moments that didn't align with the picture-perfect image the Harpers presented. Grace had started to notice them first. Small things that she dismissed as unimportant. A tension in Mark's shoulders that hadn't been there before. A distracted look in his eyes. and a sudden quietness in his once easygoing nature. She chalked it up to the demands of his job. After all, being a sheriff wasn't easy, especially in a town that looked to him for so much. But those cracks in their perfect life widened. It wasn't just Mark's mood swings or his late nights at work. There were other things. Things that didn't make sense. A misplaced item, an offhand comment, a momentary glance that lingered too long. Grace tried to ignore it, to tell herself that everything was fine. This was the man she had loved for over a decade, the father of her child. How could there be anything wrong? Willow Creek remained oblivious. To the townspeople, the Harpers were untouchable, a family so intertwined with the fabric of their community that any suggestion of trouble would be unthinkable. But within the walls of their home, Grace began to feel a growing unease, a feeling she couldn't explain, but couldn't shake. Something was wrong. The cracks weren't just in their image. They were in the foundation of their family. And what Grace didn't know was that those cracks were about to give way to something far darker than she could have ever imagined. The signs began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like faint whispers in the stillness of their seemingly perfect life. Grace Harper had always been attuned to the rhythm of her family. Mark's steady demeanor, Sophia's gentle routines. But lately those rhythms had felt out of sync, and the dissonance left her restless. Mark's behavior was the first note in the discord. He had always been a creature of habit, leaving for work at the same time each morning, coming home to share stories from his day over dinner. But now, his routines seemed fractured. There were the late nights he couldn't explain, the calls he took in hushed tones, and the way he avoided meeting her eyes when she asked if everything was okay. Grace tried to convince herself it was the stress of his job. Being the sheriff meant carrying the weight of the town's safety on his shoulders. But this was different. It wasn't just the stress. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. One evening, while tidying the living room, Grace noticed Mark's uniform jacket draped carelessly over the armrest. That was unusual for him. He was meticulous about his belongings. As she picked it up to hang it in the closet, her fingers brushed against something in the pocket. She reached inside and pulled out a small butterfly hairpin. Her heart stopped for a moment. It wasn't just any hairpin. It was Sophia's. Grace had bought it for her daughter months ago, part of a set that Sophia treasured. She had no reason to think Mark would have it, let alone carry it in his jacket. She clutched the pin tightly, her mind racing with questions she couldn't yet articulate. That night, as she lay beside Mark in bed, she couldn't shake the image of the hairpin. Then there was Sophia, sweet, innocent Sophia, who seemed blissfully unaware of the tensions simmering around her. But even her behavior began to shift in subtle ways. She seemed more withdrawn, hesitant in her interactions, particularly with her father. Grace would catch her staring out the window for long periods, her expression unreadable. When Grace asked if something was bothering her, Sophia only shrugged and returned to her drawings, her silence speaking volume. The most chilling moment came one night when Grace was putting Sophia to bed. As she tucked her in, Sophia hesitated before speaking. "Mom, can secrets be bad?" she asked, her voice soft and unsure. Grace's stomach twisted. "What kind of secrets, sweetheart?" Sophia looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the corner of her blanket. Grace forced herself to remain calm. "Did someone tell you to keep a secret, Sophia?" Sophia hesitated, then shook her head quickly. "No, never mind. It's silly." She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She told Terran. That moment stayed with Grace, gnawing at her. It wasn't just the question, it was the fear she saw flicker across her daughter's face. It was fleeting, but unmistakable. The unease Grace felt was no longer something she could ignore. The hairpin, the late nights, the tension in Mark's voice when she asked simple questions. They all pointed to something. But what? Her mind cycled through possibilities, each one darker than the last. One evening, as Mark stood by the window staring into the darkened street, Grace approached him. "Is there something going on, Mark? You've been distant." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Everything's fine, Grace. You're imagining things." But she wasn't imagining things. Grace could feel the truth, hovering just out of reach, like a shadow lurking at the edge of her vision. Grace's world was beginning to tilt, and she was no longer sure who to trust or what to believe. Little did she know, the truth was closer than she realized, waiting for the moment to strike. Matilda cupped Grace's hand in hers and looked down into silvery depth. It was late, the kind of night where the world seemed to hold its breath in silence. Grace lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of questions she couldn't silence. Mark was beside her, his breathing steady, but to Grace, it sounded hollow. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for weeks, and the feeling was now impossible to ignore. Quill was right. Her luck had finally stopped starting due to some unexplained luck of the draw. The house creaked faintly as Grace got up, careful not to wake him. She wandered through the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. Passing by Sophia's room, she paused. The faint sound of voices reached her ears. At first, she thought it might be Sophia talking to herself, something her daughter often did while immersed in her imaginary world. But then, she heard a second voice, deep, deliberate, unmistakably Mark's. Grace's chest tightened as she pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. "Remember, Sophia." Mark's voice was low, almost coaxing. "This is just between us. No one else needs to know." Sophia's response was quiet, hesitant. "But why? I don't understand. Why it has to be a secret?" Mark's tone shifted slightly, firmer now. "Because it's special. You don't want to ruin something special, do you?" Mark advanced on the ruse and adapted it so it would work. Grace's blood ran cold. Her hand instinctively covered her mouth to stifle a gasp as she slid closer to the door. Peeking through the crack, she could see the two of them. Mark was crouched beside Sophia, his hand resting on her small shoulder. Sophia looked uncomfortable, confused, her wide eyes darting to the floor. Something inside Grace shattered in that moment. She didn't fully understand what she was witnessing, but every instinct screamed at her to protect her child. Quietly retreating down the hall, she leaned against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her mind raced. Was this the answer to all the unease? The misplaced hairpin? The hushed calls? Sophia's withdrawn behavior? The next day, Grace's resolve hardened. She needed clarity, something undeniable. While Mark was at work, she searched the house, desperate for any piece of evidence that would confirm her fears. Opening the drawer of Mark's nightstand, she found a small notebook tucked beneath a stack of papers. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. What she read left her reeling. Notes and reminders written in Mark's neat handwriting, detailing times, places, and vague references to special moments with Sophia. Grace clutched the notebook to her chest, her vision blurring with tears. Her mind screamed for answers, but there was no one to ask, no one to trust. She was alone in this nightmare, and she knew she had to act. That night, she couldn't bring herself to lie in the same bed as Mark. Instead, she sat in the living room, staring at the notebook on the coffee table, the weight of it crushing her. She knew she couldn't confront him without a plan. Mark was clever, manipulative even, and she needed to think carefully about her next move. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Mark had woken up and was heading toward the hallway. Grace instinctively grabbed the notebook and slipped it behind her, as he appeared in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice casual, but Grace could hear the undercurrent of tension. "Just restless," she replied, forcing a smile. He lingered for a moment before nodding and heading back to bed. Grace's heart pounded as she watched him disappear down the hall. She knew she was running out of time. The breaking point came the following evening. As Grace went about her nightly routine, she noticed something missing from Sophia's dresser. Her favorite stuffed animal, a small bear she never went to bed without. Alarmed, she searched the room but found nothing. Then, as she turned to leave, her eyes landed on the closet door. It was slightly ajar, something Sophia never left undone. Grace opened the closet and froze. Inside, tucked among the clothes, was the stuffed bear, and beside it, another object that made her knees go weak. It was a small box, wrapped in paper adorned with butterflies, Sophia's favorite. She opened it with trembling hands to find a collection of trinkets, all too familiar. The missing hairpin, a bracelet, and even a crumpled drawing Sophia had made weeks ago. She couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. The evidence was in front of her, undeniable and horrifying. Mark had been collecting Sophia's belongings, treating them like trophies. Grace sank to the floor, clutching the box as tears streamed down her face. The truth was no longer hidden, and she knew what she had to do. She would protect her daughter, no matter the cost. However, she still wished she could look back in time, before time had stripped the stripes from Vicky's life, and seen something of the man she had once known. The tension in the Harper household had become suffocating. Every glance, every word exchanged between Grace and Mark felt like a silent battle, with truths left unspoken, yet screaming beneath the surface. Grace knew she couldn't wait any longer. The evidence she had uncovered, the whispered conversations, the notebook and the unsettling box of trinkets, painted a picture she could no longer ignore. One evening, after putting Sophia to bed, Grace stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter. Her hands trembled, her thoughts a storm of anger, fear, and heartbreak. Mark entered the kitchen, his face calm, his movements as casual as ever. But Grace saw through the facade. There was an edge to him now, a quiet calculation in the way he looked at her. She turned to face him, holding the notebook in one hand and the box of trinkets in the other. "What is this, Mark?" she demanded, her voice steady but laced with fury. Mark's eyes flickered to the items, his expression hardening. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his tone low and measured. "That's not the question," Grace shot back, stepping closer. "The question is, why do you have these? Why are you hiding things that belong to our daughter? What's going on between you and Sophia?" Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made Grace's stomach churn. "You're imagining things again, Grace. You've always had a wild imagination." Grace's grip on the notebook tightened. "Don't you dare dismiss me. I heard you in her room. I found this," she said, holding up the notebook. "Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I don't see what's happening right in front of me?" Mark stepped closer, his demeanor shifting from defensive to menacing. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Grace's voice rose, her anger finally breaking through her fear. "You've been lying to me, to this family, to everyone who trusted you. How could you do this? To her. To us." Mark's eyes darkened, and he leaned in closer. "You don't want to start something you can't finish, Grace. You have no idea what's at stake here." Grace took a step back, her heart pounding. "What's at stake?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "The truth? Protecting our daughter? Because that's the only thing that matters now. And if you think for 1 second I'm going to let you hurt her, you're wrong." Mark's expression turned cold, his voice dropping to a chilling calm. "You think you can stop me? Do you really think anyone will believe you? I'm the sheriff, Grace. People trust me. They'll believe me over you." The weight of his words hit her like a blow, but they didn't break her resolve. If anything, they strengthened it. Grace squared her shoulders, her eyes locked on his. "I don't care what anyone believes. I care about Sophia, and if protecting her means going through you, then so be it." Mark took another step toward her, his presence towering and threatening. "You need to calm down, Grace. You don't want to ruin this family." "Ruin it?" Grace's voice was ice. "You already did." For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with the tension of unspoken truths and unrelenting determination. Grace could see it in Mark's eyes, the realization that she wouldn't back down, that she would fight for Sophia no matter the cost. And Mark, true to his nature, responded the only way he knew how. "You'll regret this," he said, his tone as much a warning as a promise. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." But Grace didn't flinch. Her fear had turned to fury, and her fury to resolve. She had faced the truth, and now she would face him. The weight of Grace's discovery bore down on her like a storm that refused to pass. The confrontation with Mark had left her shaken but resolute. She no longer recognized the man she had spent years building a life with, and every instinct in her body screamed that time was running out. Sophia needed protection, and Grace was the only one who could give it to her. That night, Grace lay awake, her mind racing with questions and plans. Mark was sleeping beside her, his steady breathing a stark contrast to the chaos in her thoughts. As the hours ticked by, she replayed his threats, his dismissive tone, and the coldness in his eyes. She could no longer trust him, not with her safety, not with Sophia's. Something had to be done. The sound of a faint creak snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned her head toward the empty side of the bed. Mark was gone. The faint glow of light seeped from the crack beneath Sophia's door. Grace's chest tightened as she approached, her ears straining to catch any sound. She heard Mark's voice, low and deliberate, though the words were muffled. Sophia's soft reply followed, hesitant and uncertain. Grace's hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, pausing just long enough to steel herself. Pushing the door open, she was met with a sight that confirmed every fear she'd been harboring. Mark was sitting on the edge of Sophia's bed, his presence invasive and unwelcome. Sophia's wide eyes darted toward her mother, confusion and fear etched across her young face. "What are you doing?" Grace's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I want to see Margaret," said Grace. Mark turned, his face hardening as he stood. "I was just checking on her," he said, his tone defensive. "She couldn't sleep, but she implored me to leave my gaze down by the sea. Left, you bidder." Grace stepped into the room, placing herself between Mark and Sophia. "Get out," she said, her voice unwavering. "Now!" Mark didn't move. Instead, he folded his arms, a smirk curling at the edges of his lips. But Grace wasn't backing down. "Leave this room. Leave this house. You don't belong here anymore." Mark took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're making a mistake, Grace. You don't want to do this." Grace didn't flinch, her hands balled into fists at her sides, her rage bubbling to the surface. "The only mistake I made was trusting you," she spat. "You've betrayed this family, and I will not let you hurt her." Mark's face darkened. You think you can stop me?" The words hung in the air like a threat, a promise of the battle yet to come. Grace stood firm, her gaze locked on him, unwavering. "Watch me." Mark finally moved, brushing past her with an air of disdain as he left the room. Grace's body sagged with relief as the door clicked shut behind him. She turned to Sophia, who was trembling, her eyes brimming with tears. Grace knelt beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I won't let him hurt you, I promise." But even as she spoke the words, Grace knew this wasn't over. Mark wasn't the kind of man to give up control so easily. She needed to act before he could retaliate, before he could do more damage. That night, as she sat at the kitchen table, a plan began to take shape in her mind. She opened the drawer where Mark kept his service weapon, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The weight of it was heavier than she expected, a tangible reminder of the decision she was about to make. Her heart raced as she stared at it, her mind swirling with fear, anger, and resolve. The next time Mark tried to assert his control, Grace would be ready. She would do whatever it took to protect Sophia, no matter the cost. The breaking point had come, and Grace was prepared to fight for her daughter's safety, even if it meant going to the ultimate lengths. The house was eerily quiet, cloaked in the thick tension of an inevitable confrontation. Grace knew it was only a matter of time before Mark made his next move. He wasn't the type to let things go, especially not when his authority was challenged. She sat in the dimly lit living room, her hands clasped tightly around the cold steel of his service weapon, waiting. The hours passed slowly, each tick of the clock stretching into eternity. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Grace's heart began to race, the adrenaline surging through her veins as Mark's silhouette emerged from the shadows. He stopped in the doorway, his figure framed by the pale moonlight streaming through the window. His eyes immediately landed on the gun in her hands. "What do you think you're doing, Grace?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with an unspoken threat. Grace stood, her grip tightening on the weapon. "This ends tonight, Mark," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You are not going near her again." Mark went around. Mark took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "Put the gun down," he said, his tone shifting to one of quiet menace. "You don't want to do something you'll regret." Grace shook her head, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "I've already lost too much because of you. I won't let you take anything else." Her lips parted, and she gave Tiffany her hand to meet hers. Mark's smirk returned, his confidence unshaken. "You think anyone will believe you? That you're some hero protecting your daughter? You're just a desperate woman with no proof and no plan." His words were like gasoline on a fire. Grace's fury erupted, her voice rising. "Proof? You want proof? I've seen the way you look at her, the way you manipulate her. You think I need more proof than that?" Mark lunged toward her, his hand reaching for the gun. Instinctively, Grace stepped back, her finger tightening on the trigger. The first shot rang out, a deafening explosion that seemed to freeze time. Mark staggered, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped through his shirt. But he didn't stop. His determination only seemed to intensify. Grace fired again. And again. Each shot punctuated by the pain and betrayal that had been building inside her for weeks, months, maybe even years. By the time the echoes of gunfire faded, Mark's body lay crumpled on the floor, lifeless. The silence that followed was oppressive, the weight of what she had done settling heavily on her shoulders. She stood there for a moment, the gun still clutched in her trembling hands, staring at the man she had once loved. The man who had destroyed her family. Tears streamed down her face as the reality of her actions sank in. She had protected Sophia. but at what cost? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound behind her. She turned to see Sophia standing in the doorway, her wide, innocent eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Mom?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daisy," she said. Grace's heart broke all over again. She dropped the gun and rushed to her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It's over," she murmured, her voice cracking. "He can't hurt you anymore." But even as she held Sophia close, a new wave of despair washed over her. What kind of life would Sophia have now? What kind of judgment and cruelty would they face from the outside world? Grace knew the truth. People wouldn't see her as a mother protecting her child. They would see her as a murderer. Her mind spiraled into a dark and twisted logic. In her anguish, she became convinced there was only one way to truly protect Sophia, to ensure she would never suffer again. "I love you so much," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." The sound of a single shot shattered the stillness of the night. And the neighbors heard the gunfire. They called the police, unsure of what horrors awaited them inside the Harper home. By the time officers arrived, they found Grace sitting on the living room floor, her hands resting limply in her lap. The gun lay beside her, its barrel still warm. She didn't resist as they approached, her voice eerily calm as she confessed. "I did it," she said. "I killed him. I killed her." The scene the officers discovered was haunting. Mark's lifeless body lay in the hallway, and in Sophia's room, the young girl's still form was a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. The once idyllic Harper home had become a crime scene, a place where betrayal and pain had reached their ultimate devastating conclusion. The town of Willow Creek woke to the shocking news of the tragedy that had unfolded in the Harper household. The once idyllic family, a symbol of stability and respectability, had been torn apart in a way no one could have anticipated. The Harper home, once filled with laughter and light, now stood as a grim monument to betrayal and despair. The first responders to the scene were met with a haunting tableau. Mark Harper's body lay lifeless in the hallway, the blood pooling around him, telling the story of his violent end. In Sophia's room, the sight of the young girl's still form broke even the most hardened of investigators. Grace offered no resistance, her voice calm, yet hollow, as she recounted the events of that night. "I had to protect her," she said over and over, as though trying to convince herself as much as the officers. "He destroyed everything. He destroyed her." The evidence corroborated her story. Investigators found the notebook she had discovered, filled with cryptic entries that hinted at Mark's manipulation of Sophia. The box of trinkets, carefully hidden away, painted a chilling picture of his obsessive control. Forensic examination of the scene supported Grace's timeline, revealing a struggle and her desperate attempts to stop Mark. But even with this evidence, the tragedy was far from simple. Grace's final decision, to take Sophia's life as well as Mark's, left the investigators and community grappling with complex emotions. Was she a mother pushed beyond the brink, acting out of love and despair? Or was she a woman, consumed by rage, unable to see another way forward? The trial that followed became the talk of Willow Creek and beyond. The prosecution painted Grace as a woman who had lost control, whose actions, though rooted in pain, could not be excused. They pointed to the methodical nature of her actions, the retrieval of Mark's gun, the confrontation, and ultimately, her decision to end Sophia's life, as evidence of premeditation. The defense, however, told a very different story. They described Grace as a mother trapped in a nightmare, betrayed by the person she trusted most. They highlighted the years of emotional and psychological toll Mark's actions had taken on her, arguing that her choices were driven by a desperate need to protect her child from further harm. Experts testified about the impact of trauma, explaining how Grace's mind might have fractured under the weight of her discovery. The town itself was divided. Some saw Grace as a tragic figure, a mother who had done what she felt was necessary to save her daughter. Others viewed her as a murderer, unable to reconcile her actions with the image of the woman they thought they knew. In the days after the incident, vigils were held for Sophia. The young girl's life, though marked by challenges, was celebrated by those who knew her. Friends and neighbors gathered to share memories of her bright smile, her love for painting, and her kind heart. Candles flickered as prayers were whispered, the community united in mourning. Mark's legacy was far more complicated. Once celebrated as a hero, his name became synonymous with betrayal and manipulation. The revelations about his behavior sent shockwaves through the town, leaving many questioning how they could have missed the signs. The trust he had built over years of service was shattered, replaced by a deep sense of betrayal. Discouraged, he settled into the memory dust of his grace, his kindness, and his... As for Grace, she sat in a cold, sterile cell, awaiting the verdict that would decide her future. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her, but her thoughts remained with Sophia. She didn't care about her own fate. She only cared that her daughter was no longer in pain. The Harper family's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most perfect facade. It forced Willow Creek to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, love, and the devastating consequences of betrayal. The courtroom was packed to capacity, filled with reporters, community members, and those who had once admired the Harper family. Grace Harper's trial was not just a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle that captivated Willow Creek and beyond. The nation watched as the tragic details of the Harper household were laid bare, sparking fierce debates about morality, justice, and desperation. The prosecution wasted no time painting Grace as a calculated killer. They argued that while Mark Harper's actions were reprehensible, Grace had taken the law into her own hands in a way that could not be justified. With each piece of evidence presented, the multiple gunshots, her deliberate confrontation, and, most damning, her decision to end Sophia's life, the prosecution sought to portray Grace as a woman who had allowed her emotions to override her sense of right and wrong. Grace Harper had options, the prosecutors said in their opening statement. She could have sought help. She could have turned to the authorities. Instead, she chose violence, and that choice ended 2 lives. Sandy Poe-Perel, Jen Harker's character, describes his decision to end his own life. The defense countered with a narrative of unbearable betrayal and emotional torment. They painted Grace as a loving mother who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Witnesses described her as a devoted parent who had sacrificed everything for her family, only to discover the unthinkable. Expert psychologists testified about the effects of trauma, explaining how the discovery of Mark's actions and the pressure to protect her daughter could have fractured her decision-making. Grace Harper wasn't acting out of hatred, her attorney argued. She was acting out of love. Love for a daughter who was too young, too innocent, to understand the danger she was in. Grace's actions, however tragic, were the desperate choices of a mother who saw no other way, the silent country. When Grace herself took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her voice was steady, but filled with emotion as she recounted the months leading up to that night. She spoke of her growing suspicions, the evidence she uncovered, and the moment she found Mark in Sophia's room. Tears streamed down her face as she described the fear that had gripped her, the overwhelming need to protect her child. "I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I could save her. I thought I could stop him. I didn't want her to live with the pain he caused, the judgment the world would have for her. I thought I was protecting her. But I failed." Her testimony left many in the courtroom in tears, but it also divided the public further. Some saw her as a tragic hero, a mother who had done what she believed was right under unimaginable circumstances. Others viewed her actions as unforgivable, especially when it came to Sophia's death. Outside the courtroom, the trial became a lightning rod for debate. Protesters gathered on both sides, some holding signs that read, "Justice for Grace" and "A mother's love shouldn't be a crime," while others carried placards demanding accountability with messages like, "Murder is still murder," and "Who speaks for Sophia?" Social media exploded with heated arguments, turning the case into a national conversation about morality, mental health, and the limits of self-defense. After weeks of testimony, the jury was left to deliberate. The weight of their decision was palpable as they considered the complexities of the case. Was Grace Harper a victim of her circumstances, or had she crossed a line that couldn't be justified? The nation held its breath as the verdict was read. Grace Harper was convicted of manslaughter for Sophia's death and second-degree murder for Mark's. The court acknowledged the emotional strain she had been under, but determined that her actions could not go without consequence. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As the sentence was handed down, Grace sat silently, tears streaming down her face. For her, the trial's outcome mattered little. Her life had been irreparably changed, and the only thing she could think about was the daughter she had lost. The trial's conclusion brought no real closure for Willow Creek. The Harper family's story had left a permanent scar on the community, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of betrayal. While some believed justice had been served, others remained haunted by the tragedy, wondering if there could have been another way. The story of the Harper family left an indelible mark on Willow Creek and the countless lives it touched. What had once been a tale of love, respect, and unity unraveled into a haunting tragedy that revealed the fragile nature of trust and the devastating weight of betrayal. In the aftermath of the trial, the community struggled to make sense of what had happened. Vigils were held in Sophia's memory, her short life honored by those who had known her gentle spirit. Her love for painting and the bright, colorful world she created on paper became a poignant reminder of the innocence that had been lost. Candles flickered in front of the Harper home, a solemn tribute to the family that had once been its heartbeat. Mark Harper's name became a cautionary example of the dangers of unchecked power and trust misplaced. Those who had once celebrated him as a hero were now left to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he had become. His betrayal rippled through the community, a reminder that darkness often hides in plain sight. As for Grace, her story sparked debates far beyond the borders of Willow Creek. Was she a victim of unbearable circumstances, or was she ultimately responsible for the tragedy that unfolded? Advocates for domestic abuse survivors saw her as a symbol of the failures of a system that should have protected her and Sophia. Critics, however, argued that her actions were unjustifiable, no matter the pain she had endured. Grace's life behind bars was a stark contrast to the one she had once lived. She spent her days reflecting on the choices she had made, the love she had for Sophia, and the lengths to which that love had driven her. Letters from supporters and critics alike poured in, each one a reminder of the complexity of her story. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of all was the silence left behind. Sophia's voice, once so full of life and imagination, was now a memory. The bright colors of her drawings were replaced by the somber tones of a community grappling with its grief. The Harper family story became a chilling reminder of how even the most picturesque lives can be shattered by secrets and betrayal. It forced Willow Creek, and anyone who heard the tale, to confront difficult questions. How far would you go to protect someone you love? What happens when trust is broken in the most unimaginable way? And can there ever be true justice in the face of such loss? As the town moved forward, the Harper home remained vacant, a haunting symbol of what once was. It stood as a testament to the consequences of silence, the resilience of love, and the devastating price of betrayal. To those who hear this story, we ask, what would you have done in Grace's position? Could you have made a different choice? Or would you have been driven by the same desperate need to protect? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. Together, we can continue to explore the darkest corners of human behavior, uncovering the truths that often lie hidden in the shadows. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe and vigilant.